This is the last video on the lecture series about the research process. Now we have received the approval from the technical and ethics reviewers. We can then proceed with our actual research fieldwork. Let's start with phase 2 in the heart of the research process, data collection. Before you actually begin collecting data, there are other important preparatory steps that you should address. As I mentioned in part 1, advocacy means formally asking permission to the administrators, officials, and other authorities in your study site. For example, if your study population are patients, you need to ask permission from the hospital first. This is different from the patient's informed consent. Otherwise, you may also need to submit the proposal to the institution's own ethics board, if not yet done. So it might be best to submit directly to the ERB of your study site whenever available. Take advantage of events and technology. If your target population is, let's say, orthopedics outpatients, then you may want to take advantage of an orthopedic medical mission. It's also good practice, but of course not required, to make a table of variables. This is a summary of all the different variables or what data you will be collecting. Next are dummy tables. Dummy tables are a good way of visualizing how your results will eventually look like. Simulate how your final results page will look like, preferably using hypothetical values, so that you can see what your final product will look like even without real data yet. You will also need to train your data collectors. You need to train them on exactly how to collect data and what data needs to be collected. Once you figure out all of these preparatory steps, then you can be more confident to do your actual data collection. Now we go back to our scenario. Our advocacy would probably look like asking permission from the hospital medical director and research committee before you collect your data. So once we've done our advocacy work, now it is the time we can go to the nurse's station and get all the relevant patient charts. After collecting your data, we then proceed with the processing and analysis of data. As we mentioned earlier, data management is an often neglected part of doing research, but its importance is unfortunately highlighted at the end when researchers realize that the data they collected is ultimately wrong and they need to do data collection again, wasting precious time and precious resources. Quality control involves checking the data collection tools for completeness, accuracy, consistency, and even legibility. Now, this should be done as soon as possible, usually at the data collection point. For example, if a submitted form is not legible, then you need to verify the information from the source immediately before they are lost to follow up. Encoding is the process of transforming your data in the data collection tools into computer-readable format. Excel or Google Sheets format is a common tool used in encoding, but you need to be consistent on how you record your information. Data cleaning is both a simple and a technical part of data processing. This usually involves some methods to work with incomplete data. Once data is checked, encoded, and then cleaned, then that is the only time you should proceed with data analysis. In doing data analysis, always stick to your objectives. Once you collect all your data, you will realize that there are more information that you can extract. Now, you have to resist the temptation of doing numerous analysis which do not answer your objectives. Otherwise, you will get stuck in an analysis loop and your audience will also get confused. Do not do an analysis if it does not help answer your research question. There is no shame in submitting to third-party biostatisticians, as I mentioned earlier. But for simpler studies, or if you are capable, then you can do data analysis yourself. It is not usually required to have a biostatistician on board your study unless there are glaring data analysis issues in your results and discussion, or if you are doing a highfalutin calculation. And of course, make multiple backups. Make multiple versions of your data and your analysis files. So for our sample scenario, our data processing method would be to make sure that all data are complete, and then we can also write that we are encoding all information in Microsoft Word verbatim since we are doing a case study. And then we also need to collect all necessary pictures in the picture format, JPEG format. For our data analysis methodology, we are hiring a biostatistician named Littlefinger to do the analysis. For a case study, it's probably not needed, but just to be sure, there's no shame on getting third-party help. The next stage is the actual writing of the research report. As with any scientific or creative authors, writing the manuscript is the most procrastinated part of the research process, but there is no way going around it. It needs to be done. Your manuscript format should be based on how and where you plan to publish. You do not reinvent the wheel because journals have their own specific requirements, including the format. If you're still unsure where you want to publish, then you can use the typical IMRAD format when writing your manuscript. You have your introduction, methodology, results and analysis, and discussion. Here are just some tips on writing your research report. Just write and write. And always go back to your objectives. Don't forget to use your proposal, which we did in phase 1, as an overall framework for your research report. And again, focus on answering your research objectives. For our scenario, we are using a case series. So the format should be a case series format, but following probably the IMRAD format from a hypothetical journal of Westeros Annals. Now let's go to the last part of the research process. Well, the research process is a scientific, systematic methodology. Research communication is an art form and is beyond the scope of this lecture. However, we should ask ourselves some guide questions. Where and to whom do I need to share my study findings? Different audiences will have different requirements and expectations. For example, journals versus administrators versus the greater public will have different expectations. Conventions will also have different requirements from publications in scientific journals. When you post to social media, your audience there will also have different ways of absorbing your findings. For our scenario, our dissemination strategy is, of course, to have it published, so we submit it to the journal, and we also want to present the executive summary of our results in the next King's Landing General Hospital grand rounds so that the hospital administrators and doctors will learn from our study. In summary, there are 2 phases of research: crafting the research proposal and doing the actual research. There are several steps in the research process which includes all of these listed. We have discussed each step as well as sub-steps and provide additional important information about each step. We have also provided some hypothetical and real-life examples for each step, as well as some practical tips on how to go about each process. At the end of the day, we all agree that there are no shortcuts to doing research. No amount of reading and workshops will make us competent researchers. The only thing that we can do is do. I hope you learned something. See you in the next video.